Today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental, a real cornerstone of political science.
That's right. We're looking at the big classic comparison. Democracy versus autocracy.
For decades, the consensus view was pretty straightforward. Democracies, they have accountability, they have stability, so they should do better economically.
But the real-world data, especially from the last 50 years or so, it tells a much, much more complicated story.
It really does.
And that complication, that nuance, is our mission for this deep dive. We're not just asking if dictatorship is bad for growth.
That's too simple a question.
Exactly. We're asking which kind of dictatorship is bad for growth. Because our sources show that the economic failures we associate with non-democracies, well, they're not spread out evenly at all.
Not at all. Some just completely stunt growth, while others, and this is the surprising part, perform shockingly well.
And we're here to unpack the single most powerful idea that explains why. What researchers call the personalist penalty.
So before we jump in, maybe we should quickly set the table with our terms.
Good idea.
When we say autocracy, what we're talking about is a system where the supreme power is all concentrated in one person or maybe a tiny ruling group.
And the key thing is that there are very few, if any, real legal limits on that power, right?
Exactly. No real legal restraints, no regular way for people to give consent. Think, absolute monarchies or those classic one-man dictatorships.
And the central, really surprising finding that kind of forces us to rethink all this is that the growth penalty we've always pinned on autocracy as a whole category, it's almost entirely concentrated in just one specific type, which means we have to look inside the dictatorship.
Right. To really get at this huge economic difference, you have to split authoritarian rule into two distinct buckets. It all comes down to how power is organized.
Okay, so let's start with the one that, well, causes all the trouble, the personalist autocracy.
This is the unchecked version. This is where power is just overwhelmingly concentrated in one leader, or maybe a tiny little inner circle.
So the rule of law is basically just whatever the leader feels like that day.
It's the leader's personal whim. The sources give some classic and frankly tragic examples here. Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire.
The country he literally renamed after himself.
Yes, down to the bizarre dress code he imposed, or, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. In these places, any decision, big or small, can just change based on the mood or the paranoia of one guy.
And what that means for the power structure is that the leader only has to keep an incredibly small group of people happy. Political scientists call this the selectorate, right?
That's the term, yes. A tiny selectorate. It's the few generals, the family members, the cronies whose loyalty you absolutely need. And you have zero incentive to care about anyone else.
Okay, so that's one bucket. What's the other one? The more stable one.
The second category is institutionalized autocracies. Now, power is still held by a non-democratic group, but, and this is the critical part, it's constrained by actual bodies, like a disciplined ruling party or a powerful military junta.
So there are rules. They might not be democratic rules, but they exist.
They exist, and everyone knows them. Think about Mexico under the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. They ran the country for 70 years using party structures and internal rules.
Or post-Mao China, or even Singapore under the PAP, the People's Action Party.
Those are perfect counterexamples. They don't have popular elections, sure, but they have established procedures. They have rules for how leaders act, how policy gets made, and crucially, how one leader is replaced by another.
So the ruling elite, that selectorate, is much bigger than in a personalist system.
It's much broader, which forces the leader to actually negotiate and compromise with others in the elite.
So the theoretical difference here is just, it's profound. Institutionalized regimes have these deeper roots, which completely changes the leader's incentives.
Right. You can't just seize a bunch of wealth on a whim.
Because you risk alienating the whole party structure or the military that's actually keeping you in power.
And that institutionalization, even without elections, that's the key to policy continuity. The sources point out that where power is personalized, developing any kind of rational legal system is basically impossible.
So you get constant uncertainty, policy reversals, corruption that just spirals because there's no one to stop the leader. It makes the entire system incredibly unstable.
Especially when it comes time for a new leader to take over.
Okay, this is where we need to pivot from the theory to the hard data. Because the numbers and the research are, well, they're startlingly clear.
They really are.
The economic penalty we usually blame on all dictatorships. It is decisively, overwhelmingly concentrated in those personalist regimes.
Let's just run through the average growth numbers. This is GDP growth over a really long period. Democracies, on average, come in at 2.4% growth.
Okay, 2.4%.
Now, look at those institutionalized autocracies, like PRI Mexico or post-Mao China. They clock in at 2.31%.
Wait, hang on. That's basically identical.
Statistically indistinguishable.
Let me just pause on that for a second, because that has to be the most counterintuitive finding for most people listening. Democracies average 2.4, and stable institutionalized autocracies average 2.31.
It really challenges a lot of assumptions.
I mean, why do we spend so much time talking about the economic necessity of elections if these stable dictatorships are performing statistically the same?
Because what investors and businesses crave is stability and institutional constraint. It turns out the source of that constraint, whether democratic or not, matters less than its existence.
Wow. Okay, so now for the other shoe to drop. What about the personalist regimes?
This is where it falls off a cliff. Their average growth rate drops to just 1.37%.
Okay, so that 1 percentage point difference between, say, 2.31 and 1.37, it might sound small.
But the power of compounding is incredible.
Right. If you project that difference out over a generation or two, say 50 years, a country that keeps that extra 1% growth ends up with a 64% higher income level, a staggering difference.
It's not a subtle blip. It's the difference between a country lifting itself out of poverty and one that stays structurally underdeveloped.
So this forces us to completely revise how we think about this.
It does. The growth performance of institutionalized dictatorships is, statistically, the same as long-term democracies. The so-called autocratic penalty really is just a personalist penalty. It's isolated to those regimes where unconstrained individuals treat the state budget like their own private bank account.
Okay, so the numbers absolutely prove the case. Personalist rule costs the nation nearly 2/3 of its potential wealth over 50 years. So why? What are the specific mechanisms driving this penalty?
The research points to three main economic drivers that really stem from that unchecked power. First, private investment just collapses. Second, public goods like schools and roads are generally much worse. And third, these systems have a much higher risk of large-scale conflict, like civil war.
Let's stick with that first one for a second, private investment, because that's so critical. How does personalism destroy that incentive?
Well, think about it. If you're an entrepreneur or an international company, you need predictability. You need to know the rules won't change tomorrow.
Right.
In a personalist system, the leader or one of their cronies can just decide to seize your factory. They can change the tax laws overnight. They can take your assets, and you have absolutely no one to appeal to.
There's no independent court, no institution to protect you.
None. Your success depends entirely on being in the leader's good graces, not on the rule of law. So why would you build something that takes 20 years to pay off if the guy in charge might just change his mind next Tuesday? The time horizon just shrinks dramatically.
And that short-term thinking must be a huge problem for public services, too. If the leader only cares about that tiny selectorate, why would they ever invest in broad public goods like education or public health?
They wouldn't, and they don't. This leads right to that second mechanism, poorer public goods. The money gets diverted into what economists call rent-seeking.
Which is basically just finding ways to extract wealth from the system for the elites.
Precisely. Instead of delivering services, you see this strong correlation between high corruption, which thrives in these systems, and awful outcomes like high infant mortality. The money meant for clinics just gets stolen.
And there's another fascinating driver behind this poor governance, which is this idea about competence. The research suggests personalist dictators, almost, intentionally surround themselves with incompetent people.
It sounds counterintuitive, but it's a survival strategy.
The survival strategy.
The leader is terrified of appointing a genius, especially a brilliant economist or a capable manager who might one day become popular and powerful enough to challenge them.
So they'd rather have someone loyal than someone who's actually good at their job.
Exactly. They have a much stronger incentive to pick subordinates based on intense personal loyalty or family ties.
Yeah.
They want to be the smartest person in the room, even if it means the room is functionally stupid.
And that has to just gut the government's ability to function, what the sources call state capacity.
It completely undermines it. You can think of state capacity as having sort of three dimensions.
Okay.
There's its amount, like how much tax it can collect, its position, which is the quality of the bureaucracy, and its ability, things like controlling corruption and enforcing law and order.
And personalized rule just attacks those last two.
It destroys them.
Yeah.
When you fill top positions with loyal but incompetent relatives, the state loses its ability to function rationally.
And this is where you see the big contrast with institutionalized systems, right? Whether they're democratic or authoritarian, they have more flexibility.
So much more. Imagine you need to transition from a war footing to fixing an economic crisis. In a personalist system, the general who won the war might stay in charge of the economy, even if he's useless, because the leader is too scared to fire him.
But in an institutionalized system like China's party state or a democracy,
The rules allow for a more rational transfer of power, or at least for putting the right experts in charge. A technocrat can rise up during a crisis without threatening the whole regime.
and this connects to that really deep insight about democracy's long-term effect. It's not just about what kind of government you have today.
No, it's about the accumulated experience. A country's historical stock of democracy, that long history of stable, accountable rule, that's what really builds high-quality institutions over time.
So stability is the key.
The durability of the constraints on power is what matters most. An unstable democracy can actually perform worse than an entrenched institutional autocracy, just because that short-term unpredictability scares off investment.
The conclusion here seems completely unavoidable. We have to move beyond this simple and frankly misleading binary of autocracy versus democracy.
That simple contrast just hides what's really going on. The critical variable is institutional variation, how concentrated is power.
And the core lesson for all of us, for policymakers, for citizens, is that institutional constraints are what matter.
Right. Whether those constraints come from the checks and balances of a liberal democracy or the internal rules of a disciplined authoritarian party, they provide a measurable, very real defense against the worst economic outcomes that come from unchecked personal power.
So let's end with a final provocative thought for you to take away. It ties this idea of accountability right back to that small selectorate concept. The sources bring up the massive famine during Mao's Great Leap Forward. This was a catastrophic government-made disaster. Millions died.
And yet, it didn't really threaten Mao's leadership or the Communist Party. Why? Because he only had to answer to a small, insulated group of elites. Their interests were completely disconnected from the welfare of the masses who were starving.
So we'll leave you with this question to chew on. What forms of accountability, beyond just the simple act of voting, are truly effective? What ensures that leaders, no matter the regime type, actually prioritize the welfare of the many over the narrow self-serving interests of the tiny group that keeps them in power?
Something to think about. And if you found this exploration as fascinating as we did, please do subscribe for more insights, and definitely visit www.dansplain.xyz. You'll find the latest deep dives, articles, products, and a whole lot more.
Until next time, keep digging deeper.